I'm Slava Tsilba. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Dr. Dean Baker. You co-founded the Center for Economic and Policy Research in 1999. Your areas of research include housing and macroeconomics, intellectual property, social security, Medicare and European labor markets. You are the author of several books, including Rigged, How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. Your blog, Beat the Press, provides commentary on economic reporting. You received your BA from Swarthmore College and your Ph.D. in economics from the University of Michigan. Dr. Baker, if your PhD were plagiarized, you would be outraged, the academic community would be outraged. How is that different from violations of intellectual property rights, for example, in the case of vaccines?
Well, very, very different issues. If someone were to plagiarize my dissertation, they would be claiming that they had done work that I had done and they hadn't done. They'd be lying. It'd be a fraud. Whereas if they were to make a copy of my dissertation and spread it around, without paying me money for it, that's fine. And the whole issue here of intellectual property is you have in effect a public good that we're trying to privatize. We have knowledge. So in the case of, writing a song, it's already been created. So the issue of a copyright there is preventing someone from making copies of it. I could still, if I wrote a song, I could play it as much as I want. And anyone else could play it as much as they want without copyright protection. Case of patents is the same story. So we're talking about the vaccine. If we got rid of patent rights on the vaccines for the coronavirus, people in the United States could still get just as many vaccines. What that would mean is that you'd have other countries, India, Brazil, other countries that might have the technology, that they also would be able to produce the vaccine. So the point here, it's a non-exclusive good that others could enjoy without diminishing my ability to enjoy it. So to my view, that's a great thing. And again, I take a strong stand on plagiarism. That's a very, very different issue. That's a version of fraud.
But don't intellectual property rights make sure there is no effectively bootlegging, that it is actually produced the way it is produced? How do we know the version produced in India or South Africa or Venezuela or wherever is actually authentic and is working the way the original version is supposed to work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's something that's often confused in discussions of these issues where there's a distinction between a counterfeit and an unauthorized copy. So let's say someone produced the drug and they said it's Pfizer's vaccine, so it was produced by Pfizer, and it wasn't. Okay, that's counterfeit. So they're saying, Pfizer made it, and in fact, Pfizer didn't make it. So if you thought Pfizer made it, you might believe that Pfizer has quality control. I think they probably do, so that would be telling you that this is a safe vaccine. It is what you're expecting. On the other hand, if some producer in a third country, India, Brazil, whoever it might be, that they produced it and they put their own name on it. They didn't put Pfizer's name on it. They put their own name on it. Well, then you're relying on their credibility, and maybe it's as good, maybe it isn't. But, we have ways to monitor that. And again, with the case of drugs, that's an unusual case because generally, I can't speak for everywhere, but in most countries, it's illegal to sell a drug without the government's approval. So the United States has the Food and Drug Administration. Most other countries have something comparable, and it's generally illegal to sell that drug without the government's approval. So again, this is quite apart from patents. So this is saying, if I'm producing a drug in India and I'm claiming it's this specific drug, well, the government certifies that. It has nothing to do with patent. It has to be that, again, people might do it. I mean, we know people make black market drugs. It's done. But, that has nothing to do with patents. That's simply a matter of saying, okay, this is what it is. And if you don't do that, then that's fraud. And obviously, it's potentially very harmful in the case of drugs. And, of course, people can and should be prosecuted for that. But that's a different issue from patent protection.
In a recent Monk debate with Thomas Bekweny, Director General of the International Pharma Trade Association, you said, quote, "You have very little incentive to develop the technical expertise to produce the Pfizer vaccine if you are going to get arrested for doing so. Could you please explain how intellectual property rights are enforced? What would likely happen if a country or a company disregarded these rights? For example, India or South Africa defied the World Trade Organizations."
Yes, so we've had a kind of game of whack-a-mole with the pharmaceutical industry over vaccines. So what they've been saying is, well, our patents really don't matter. Of course, there's the context for this. There's a resolution before the WTO put up by South Africa and India calling for patents to be suspended for the duration of the pandemic on vaccines and also treatments and tests. And the pharmaceutical industry is very strongly opposed to that, predictably. And they're saying, well, that really wouldn't matter anyhow. And part of that argument is that other countries don't have the technical expertise to produce these vaccines. They're complex manufacturing processes, which of course is in part true. I mean, the Pfizer vaccine is a complex manufacturing process. It's a mRNA vaccine, a relatively new technology. Same with Moderna. All of them are somewhat complex. So you couldn't just, we couldn't just go into our garage and start making the vaccine. The point I and others have made about India and South Africa and several other developing countries, they do actually have expertise. That doesn't mean they could produce the vaccine tomorrow. What we would like is for Pfizer to actually share that expertise as well. They could be paid for it, but do webinars, do consultations, share the expertise so that you could get factories up and running as quickly as possible, as many places as possible. But the other point, to say they don't have the expertise, well, a generic company in India, India, of course, is far and away the world's biggest manufacturer of drugs. So they do have plenty of expertise. A generic company in India would have no incentive to try and reverse engineer. How could they? No one would have incentive right now to sit down and figure out, okay, how could we produce the Pfizer vaccine? Because if they were actually to design a factory to produce it, well, Pfizer would go ahead and prosecute them for violating their patent. And the Indian government, at least, would be expected to. I mean, that could end up being a very serious issue in trade, because maybe the Indian government wouldn't do that. But we meaning the United States government, would certainly be pressuring them to do that. So, at least an established drug company, and you don't imagine someone doing it in their backyard. So an established drug company probably doesn't want to get itself in that legal morass. So they're not about to devote a lot of resources to figuring out how they could produce the Pfizer vaccine when they don't have a legal right to do it.
One argument against that resolution by India and South Africa was innovation and competition. How does it relate? It seems paradoxical considering we are talking about patent monopolies.
Yeah, the argument that the industry makes is that they need incentive for innovation. So the argument is that they're not going to devote their resources to develop new drugs or vaccines, whatever it might be, if they can't sell it as a monopoly. Because if everyone's producing the drug, so Pfizer develops a new drug, a new vaccine, and there's other producers that are selling it and they haven't paid for the research, then it's going to be very difficult for Pfizer or whoever happens to be the innovator to recover their research costs. That's a true argument, but there's 2 points to be made here. First off, in the case of the vaccines, they've almost certainly more than covered their research costs many times over. If we take Pfizer, they had an advanced purchase agreement with the U.S. government where we agreed to buy up 100 million doses right off the bat at $2 each, $2 billion, which easily covered their research costs because they were only researching for 8 months, or in fact less than 8 months. We know that because the virus didn't exist before February, at least not as a worldwide pandemic. And they had a vaccine approved by our Food and Drug Administration in November, and it was even earlier in the UK. And there were also advanced purchase agreements in the UK and in Europe, other places. So they had very, very low risk there. Now, in the case of Moderna, we actually paid for the research up front. So they again developed a vaccine. They were at the forefront right alongside Pfizer. And we had actually paid, we mean the US government, we paid $500 million or about $450 million for the initial research and the phase 1-2 trials, which almost certainly would have covered their costs by any normal calculation. And then we threw out another $450 million to pay for their phase 3 trials. So we literally paid the whole bill. So, you know, they don't have a story to say, oh, well, we have no incentive. But the other point that I'd love to see people take away from this is the Moderna example is a great one to me, because we had the government actually pay for the research and testing of the vaccine. So in the United States, we already spend somewhere around $45 billion a year, we meaning the federal government, through the National Institutes of Health and several other health agencies on mostly basic research. Sometimes it's more final research. We have had drugs developed and tested on the government's dime, but most of it is more basic research. And in the case of Moderna, we actually paid for the development of a vaccine. It was a success. So to my view, that's a great story, but we should leave the patent out of the picture, because it's a little bizarre to me that on the one hand, here it is, the US taxpayers paying for the research, paying for the testing of the drug, and then we tell Moderna, oh, go get a patent on it and then charge whatever you feel like. You know, it's pay for it once, don't pay for it twice. And I think the model of paying for research in advance is a great one, because in addition to making the final product available as a generic, or at least it should be available as a cheap generic, on top of that, you could require that the research be open source so that everyone could benefit from it. So if we had done that with Moderna, what we could have said was, okay, everything along the way is open sourced, which means everyone could benefit from your knowledge, from what you get from it, from your clinical test. We'd know all the clinical test results. And then on top of that, you know, the manufacturing process, that also would be open source, so that we wouldn't be in a situation where only Moderna is able to manufacture it. We'd have other companies around the world with the expertise. So I think that's a great model. Unfortunately, we only pursued half of it. We gave them the money, but we also gave them the patent rights.
And when there is the article by Lee Fan in the Intercept, drug makers promise investors they will soon hike COVID vaccine prices. March 18th, 2021. There is a quote from Moderna President Stephen Hodge. Quote, post-pandemic, as we get into those, what I will call seasonal epidemics, what you would expect to happen with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we would expect more normal pricing based on value.
This is a remarkable story, not altogether surprising, but nonetheless remarkable. They had, from their vantage point, concessionary prices. You know, so when I was mentioning the advanced purchase agreements, they view that as concession. Now, obviously, they're making plenty of money on the advanced purchase agreements. They're charging $2 a vaccine. I'm sorry, $20. I think I said $2 earlier. $20 a vaccine. I'm sure the actual cost of manufacturing the vaccine and distributing it's probably $2 or $3, $4 at most. So they were doing very well at, you know, the prices in the advanced purchase agreements, and same with Moderna. But the idea is that, okay, that was during the pandemic. Let's say, you know, next 3, 4, 5 months, we get the pandemic under control in the US and at least the other wealthy countries. Might be much longer, of course, in the developing world, but at least in the wealthy countries who get it under control, what they're expecting now is that there'll be variants of the virus. And also, of course, we don't know how long the protection, even if there weren't variants, we don't know how long the protection from the vaccine will last. So the point is that come next fall or maybe next winter, we're all going to need shots again. And then they expect, or at least this is what their CEO is saying, they expect to be able to charge much higher prices. So this is going to be, you know, kind of the cow that keeps giving milk, that they're just going to get money year after year after year because, you know, there'll be variants or people will need a booster every year, similar to what we have with flu shots. So most people get a flu shot every year. So their vision, I assume, is something like that, but they'll be charging much higher prices.
And that after being paid by the government in advance. Handsomely.
Yeah, so this is a very good deal. So They get, in the case of Pfizer, it was a very low risk proposition because, suppose the vaccine had turned out not to be very good. There were others that were better. We still would have been obligated to pay them $2 billion for 100 million doses. So, and again, a short time frame. So typically, if you listen to the pharmaceutical industry, they'll say, oh, it could take us 15, 20 years to develop a drug from early stage preclinical testing to getting it through the final approval process. And that's to some extent true. I mean, they exaggerate, but there is a lot of time involved. In this case, we know there was 8 months. They started the process in March, and they have a approved vaccine in November. So we know it was 8 months. It wasn't this long period. So they weren't taking a big risk. And again, in the case of Moderna, literally no risk, because suppose at the end of it, the Food and Drug Administration, the other regulatory agencies didn't pass muster. Well, they got paid. So they literally had no risk. But now they're going to say, oh, okay, well, year after year after year, we're going to be selling these vaccines and charging considerably higher prices than they do already. So they're going to get a lot out of this, at least in their vision.
Not enforcing the intellectual property rights on these vaccines, how would that affect the bottom lines of these corporations?
Well, if we didn't enforce their patent rights, they obviously would get less money than they had hoped. And again, looking at Pfizer, looking at Moderna, if we just snapped our fingers and said, okay, from this point forward, anyone who wants to produce them could produce them, they'd still come out way ahead. I mean, you do any sort of calculation what their research costs are versus which they've already made selling the vaccines, there's no way they're not coming out considerably ahead. Now, they won't come out as much ahead as if we did honor their patents. So it's not as though they would have a lot to cry about if they no longer had their patent rights honored as of, March 18th, 2021. They'd have still made plenty of money, obviously just less than what they had expected to make or what they had hoped to make, maybe is a better term. So they would not have a lot to complain about that.
I would like to address the testing and the vaccine rollout. In your article, Dealing with a Pandemic as if Human Lives Mattered, February 2nd, 2021, you say, quote, "It's hard to look at the track record over the last year and not conclude that governments failed badly in their efforts to control the pandemic. This is partly due to corruption and a failure of imagination, as in the decision not to open source the development of vaccines, treatments, and tests. How do you justify the very serious charge of corruption?"
Well, corruption, I would say, in the sense of trying to ensure the profits of the pharmaceutical industry over human lives. So what strikes me, what we should have wanted was open sourcing all the technology so that we could have produced the vaccines as quickly as possible. We should have had stockpiles of the vaccines, hundreds of millions, if not billions, of all the ones that went to phase 3 testing. So phase 3 testing is, of course, the final phase. That's when you give the vaccine to tens of thousands of people, a control group and a placebo group. And it invariably takes a substantial period of time, 3-4 months, because you need enough people in the control group to actually get the pandemic. So you have a test, so you have a valid test. So you have this 3 or 4 month period where you're waiting to see what the results are. And what would have made sense is to, during that period, have everyone in the world who has the technology, has the ability, you give them the technology, has the ability to produce these vaccines, develop large stockpiles, as I say, 400 or 500 million of each of them, maybe over 1 billion, or at least a capacity to produce more quickly, maybe tens of millions or hundreds of millions a month. Because again, we want not just the United States and Europe and other wealthy countries, we want the developing world to get this, both as humanitarian, but also as for our own good. Because if it ends up being the case that in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, wherever it might be, that you develop a new strain of the viruses mutate, as we know, that's vaccine resistant, possibly more deadly, we're back at ground zero. Again, maybe we could develop a new vaccine, but everyone who's been inoculated, suddenly they have to go out and get it again. We have to produce more. So we should have stockpiled large numbers of the vaccines. And what someone could rightly say is, well, we didn't know they were effective. Before the phase 3 tests, we didn't know. That's right. But the cost of producing say 500,000, make it 1 billion of vaccines, and having them have to throw them out because it turns out they're not effective, or maybe they're not safe, there's side effects, or that could be, we didn't know that. That cost is trivial compared to the health risk, the number of lives that are lost, and for that matter, the straight out economic costs that, the US, Europe, other countries, they're largely shut down because they have to slow the spread of the pandemic. So the fact that we didn't place an absolute priority on producing as many vaccines as possible as soon as they went into the phase 3 testing, maybe even earlier. I mean, arguably, you could say the results from phase 1-2 testing were good enough. I mean, that's not my judgment, but someone else might make that judgment and say, yeah, there's good reason to think they're going to be successful. Let's start now. But certainly by the point where they're in phase 3 testing, that should have been a point at which we started massively producing all these vaccines. And again, just sharing the technology as widely as possible. So if you had a factory in India and Brazil, wherever it might be, that could be retooled, we should have had them doing that. And it was it was a failure with enormous consequences that we didn't do that.
And how do you make sure that politicians who apparently are primarily interested in securing these pharma profits, who are heavily lobbied by the pharma industry, engage with your ideas and support you?
Well, it is very hard to move political opinion here for two reasons. I mean, one, the obvious one, the pharmaceutical industry is tremendously powerful and, they fight like crazy. I mean, we're seeing this with their efforts to block the Indian South African initiative at the World Trade Organization. They're fighting that very, very hard and, really coming up with a lot of disingenuous arguments. You referred to my debate earlier with Thomas Cooney, the Director General of the International Pharmaceutical Association. He said, patents aren't a problem. It's not the vaccines. The reason we can't distribute more is we don't have enough vials and syringes. I mean, I can't answer that one, but that would be a little mind-boggling to me. I mean, I assume these people aren't morons. Why we weren't producing billions of vials and syringes to make sure that we could distribute vaccines when we had that really is kind of mind-boggling. So I can't say for 100% certainty that he's not telling the truth, but all I could say is if he is telling the truth, we really have some very big problems. But the other part of the story is that there's a real problem among intellectuals, even many progressive intellectuals. They literally can't think beyond patents as a mechanism for producing, for motivating innovation. And I don't know how many times I've had these arguments with people where they say, well, if we didn't have patent monopolies, what would be the incentive? And I've had people, economists, not just someone I grabbed randomly. I've had economists where I'd almost have to be yelling at them. They would do it for money. And, the idea that people work for money shouldn't be a strange idea, economists, because most people, of course, do work for money. So the idea that we would pay drug companies up front, we would pay for their research. We did that with Moderna. We would pay for their research. And, again, they'd have contracts. If a company didn't produce anything, they wouldn't get their contracts renewed. I point to the U.S. military industry. I'm not a big fan of the U.S. military industry, but if you want to point to someone who does work on contracts, we have companies, Lockheed, Boeing, they make billions of dollars working on contracts, designing weapon systems, designing fighter bombers. They make money on that. They might get patents too, but they're getting money basically based on their government contracts. So the idea that you would have drug companies that make money based on government contracts rather than patent monopolies, you have a lot of intellectual types that just find it very, very hard to understand. I don't understand why they find it hard to understand, but they do. And that makes it harder to move the debate because you have people that, as I say, for whatever reason, they can't seem to think beyond the current system.